Hello and welcome to the VEST webinar series. I'm Frank Newsom, your moderator for today's webinar session. And today we'll show you how to deploy a custom MDTools library for use within NetBlok3D. This webinar will last approximately 30 minutes and you'll be able to submit questions or comments at any time during the webinar by posting in the question section located within your webinar control panel. Questions may be answered as they're posted, or we'll try to address them in the last 5 minutes or so of the webinar. Note that today's session is being recorded and that the audio is muted for all attendees. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please use the chat window to alert our support staff. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's webinar session, Megan O'Neill. Megan manages scope and delivery of VEST 3D cloud product releases, including NetBlok3D, which will be showcased during today's webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to Megan to kick off today's webinar topic.
Great, thank you, Frank, and thank you everyone for coming. Today we're going to be talking about sharing custom cavity libraries within NetBlok3D. So when we came up with the idea for this webinar, one of the first questions that everyone was asking is, what are you talking about? What is a custom? Is it a custom cavity? Is it a custom cavity library? So to begin this webinar, we're going to go through that conceptually and a bit of vocabulary that I'll be using throughout the duration of the webinar. So a custom cavity is a cavity that is modified from the default. So you can take a default cavity that's included in the default library when you download MDTools, or when you open just a blank version of NetBlok, you're going to have a default library from VEST. That library is going to have about 100 different sub-libraries of different manufacturers, of different bolt holes, drill holes, footprints, interface patterns, all sorts of different things. And some people just use the default library, and that's fine. It's based off of publicly available information. Some people have a specific way of manufacturing a cavity, or they have a very unique cavity interface pattern that isn't included in that default library. So they're able to go into the MDTools Library Manager and either suppress a port, change the diameter of a drill hole, or change the default length of the drill hole. So once they make these changes in their library, they don't have to change them every single time that cavity is inserted onto the block. So you're saving a lot of rework time by having your library exactly how you want it. You can also change your naming system. If you have a specific name you want to call a cavity or interface pattern, you can change that in the library and save it. So this may be news for some users. Some users may say, of course, we've been developing this library over the last 20 years. We have a highly developed, highly custom library full of custom cavities. When I say custom cavity, it means something, a cavity or interface pattern that's different than the default. So a custom library could certainly be full of custom cavities, but it doesn't have to be. So this graphic is a little bit like a Venn diagram. So the default library is this massive, thousands of cavities, 100 different sub-libraries. And if you know, I don't use all that. My organization, we don't use 90% of the manufacturers. We only use metric, or we only use imperial. You are only using a subsection of this library. So requiring users, both MDTools and NetBlok users, to sort through a colossal default library just for a small subsection of cavities, every time you search for a cavity, you're losing time, you're wasting time. So your library could just be a subsection of the default library, or it could have some unique custom cavities, even cavities that are made from scratch that we at VEST have never seen before, but you use on a daily basis. So the point of making your own library is to have exactly what you need, nothing more, nothing less. So every time you touch it, it's more efficient. But what does this have to do with NetBlok3D? Well, prior to our latest library enhancement, if you were a cloud user with NetBlok3D, your only option was to use the colossal default library. Now we are allowing users to upload the custom library. So what people have been doing before, and what MDTools users currently do, is they make their cavity adjustments, they make their library adjustments in the MDTools Library Manager, which you can download on the desktop with or without an MDTools subscription. make those changes to cavities, libraries, and then MDTools maps to that library file that you've created. We support both Microsoft Access and SQL database. So MDTools maps to that library, and whenever you're opening things, you get your own custom library. That was previously impossible in NetBlok3D on the cloud because it wasn't mapping to desktop. So now we have a two-step process to get that library onto NetBlok3D so that everyone in the organization uses the same library. So when NetBlok was using the default library, you could have someone designing in NetBlok say, look, I've made this block, it's beautiful. They send it to a design engineer who uses MDTools, and they go, I have to replace every single cavity that you've put on that block because you designed it using things that our manufacturers don't allow, or that we don't deal with those customers, those manufacturers. So the first step is taking that library file that you've probably already been using in MDTools, or if you don't have MDTools, you can just take the default library and trim it down to what you can actually use, and your data administrator will upload it to our project space. So our project space is the place where we manage where we and the data administrator with one organization will organize the users of the cloud products, as well as this custom data like libraries and some specific user-based settings. So everyone that uses NetBlok3D doesn't need to go into our project space. We're going to go in there later in this webinar, and this is going to be something that just the data administrator needs to do. So if you're an organization with one person in it, that one person can be the data administrator. Or if you're an organization and you have 100 users of NetBlok3D, you have one data administrator. So every one of those users doesn't have to worry about making their own custom library. The whole point here is to get everyone on the organization on the same page, to eliminate rework, and to have any customizations that have been made or are being made available to everybody at the same time. We'll go into this two-phase process later on in the webinar. So you may ask, once you get into NetBlok3D, then what? What's the point of adding this custom library? I design a block, and where does that block go? So from NetBlok3D, you can either export an MBXML file that can either be open in MDTools or later on in NetBlok3D. So as an MDTools user, I could say, oh, well, my desktop's at work. I want to get on my Chromebook and just lay out a manifold really quick. I want to get it started. And then I can do some more advanced design checks, check bend, more advanced features when I get in. So that MBXML can go back and forth between NetBlok and MDTools, no problem. You can also generate a layout drawing PDF or DWG. So that's just going to be something that you can share with the customer to get an idea of what the block looks like. You can also generate a step file that can be open in any CAD platform. It's not going to have all the smart colorings that you're going to see in NetBlok and MDTools, but it is going to have all of the cavities, all of the CAD models that you've assigned where they need to be. And you can also produce shrink-wrapped versions of those last three assets. So for those of you that don't know, a shrink wrap is going to not include construction ports. So a customer can still see all the working ports and interface patterns that are on the block itself, but you as a designer can preserve your intellectual property while still sharing something with the customer. All right, and with that, let's go into the MDTools Library Manager. So if you're an MDTools user, you've probably seen this before, and if not, I will do a brief introduction here. It's not going to be anything super elaborate because we have already done webinars, we already have tutorials about the webinar, or about the Library Manager. So this is just going to be a brief overview. So first thing that I would do, go to Options, and I'd select the library file I want to edit. So here I've just labeled this one a basic sales engineer library. Say I'm an organization, I'm sending a basic sales engineer on the road. I want them to be able to start laying out a manifold with a customer, but I don't want them to go overboard. So I've made them a small version of our custom library. I could also directly share the same library that the design team with MDTools uses, but for this example, I'm using an almost comically small library just to show that it is different than the default with thousands of cavities. So I've got that library uploaded, and as you can see, I've done a lot of the work in advance here. This is the inch version. It's incredibly small. I've got 3 cartridge valves here. I've got some construction ports. I've got a DO3 and a couple SIE ports. Incredibly small library. Yours would most likely look a lot bigger than this. I can also go into settings and say, you know, I want to modify the millimeter library. And I also have a comically small millimeter library. This one's a little bit bigger, but I've customized all of my library names to what I want to call them. I've taken any specific manufacturer out. So I have cartridge valves, drills, expander plug ports, and I don't have a lot in these libraries. So if I know my manufacturer, hey, these are the only sizes they're going to use, you can do that rather than going to import cavities with a default where you're going to see 30 to 40 different expander plug sizes. With cartridge valves here, you can see I've got, this is directly from the default MDTools library. This is exactly how we found it with public information. But if I say, you know, our company does it a little different, I can make this custom one. Now, this is a complete nonsense cavity that I've just made to prove a point here. But you can see I can go in there and I've added an extra port in this custom version. It's skinny and doesn't make much sense, but it's there. And I've made the entire cavity just a little bit longer than its default, just to show that customization. Okay, so now that I have my libraries ready to go, I'm going to go into I'm going to log in with my organization account. This isn't for actual Moog. These are just my initials and organization. And while that's going, I'm going to show you what default NetBlok3D would be like. So many of you have already seen the default version of NetBlok3D, but after looking at my very, very small libraries I had in the library manager, we can see here that this is much larger. This is the default. This is what, if you were to trial or subscribe to NetBlok3D today, that you'd see all of these libraries. And if you're working from an XML, a schematic from NetScheme or Hydra, that's very convenient because you can just go, you can upload the schematic and you can start dragging and dropping cavities that are already labeled in there. But if you aren't working from a schematic, you have to work fresh from the library, especially if you're new to the manifold design business. Knowing exactly what you need can be a little difficult, as you might have to grab a cavity, say, this is what I want, and try to preview it. And we'll refresh. And needing to insert them and say, oh, is this the right size, or this the right size? And it can get a little tedious if you don't know exactly what you're already wanting to use. When I log into OPS, just calling our project space OPS, I can see every app that I'm subscribed to. So being a Vest user, I'm subscribed to all of our cloud products, but you might only see NetBlok3D if you're only a NetBlok user, or only NetScheme, or whatever you're subscribed to. The first thing I can do while I'm here as the organization data administrator is I can check on my users. So I'm the only user of my own organization, but I can see I've got another license that I could assign if I wanted to. I can do that for all of the apps, and I can go in there and I can also say, I can change, reassign, I can delete users. I can also reset a password for a user that forgets their login information. The big one we're focused on today is uploading the library. So I'm using an access library, so I want an access data type. I'm using both metric and imperial, so I've checked the button for both. And now I'm going to upload that library. Got my basic sales engineer library. I'm using the dot separator, and I will upload it now. Take just a moment here. And there we are. Now, the next step is validation. Because it's a smaller library, it shouldn't take a few minutes, mainly a few moments. But what it's doing here is just making sure that the files that I'm uploading, that I'm actually uploading access files that are cavities, that I'm not trying to upload my Hydra or NetScheme symbol library or just some other thing that I happen to have tried to pull from my local files. And now this allows me to open a review environment as the data administrator. So I can go into NetBlok3D here, and this is just, it's going to say sandbox. And when I move out of this step, it'll automatically close the sandbox. But this just lets me test what I've brought in. So with the metric one, I remember we had our base cavity, and we also had our custom cavity. And you can see with our custom cavity, we've got that kind of funky third port here. And I just want to make sure that I can still assign net information to all of my ports. And it looks like I can. So depending on the size of my library, I could do any amount of testing in here. I could test for 30 seconds. I could do a couple days worth of testing. But if I leave this page as the data administrator, when I come back to our project space, it's going to reopen it here. So I can keep opening this review environment and checking my cavities, make sure they do what I want to do before I deploy them to my entire organization. Once I'm ready to deploy, I'm going to go to the publish step. I'm just going to title this Basic Sales Webinar and publish. This is our release log. So I currently have Basic Sales Webinar active. I can see that here. Now, any of my users in my organization, if they log into NetBlok3D right now, they will see this Basic Sales Webinar. That will be the library they have access to. Now, if for some reason I say, oops, I made a mistake, I have two options here. I can either disable the corporate library, which will return it to the default library. Put that back now. Or I can restore my previous library. So say I realize my new library, I uploaded something wrong, and the old one, not bad. There's the restored library. Switch that back up. And there's one more thing that I can do in OPS right now, and it has to do with the construction ports. So in NetBlok right now, this isn't my organization account, so this is my single user individual that I don't have tied to an organization. So right now, if I were to insert this port, and I said I want to insert a construction port, click on this one, I can see that it automatically selected a short port 10, but it's going to give me everything that fits on this cavity. So my company might not even use SAE ports as construction ports, but I still have the option to, if I really wanted to, I put a giant one over here. There we go. That looks crazy. Yeah, by default, it just wants you to do the 10. Ta-da! But when we're using OPS to make our experience more customized, we can go through the library we just added. So if you remember, I didn't add that many expander plugs. I only added 3. And I can choose of those which I'd like to add. So in my metric library, I'm going to add all 3 expander plugs. And I have some SAE flanges, but they are pretty big, so I'm not going to add those. And I have some SAE ports. I made another custom modified one, so I'll add that. I'll add a 4 and I'll add a 10, just to show some things there. In my Imperial library, I only have SAE ports and SAE plugs, so I'm only going to add the plugs. So now when I use the construction port command in accounts that are associated with this organization, they will only draw from these construction ports. So I'm going to log out of this account and log in with my organization account. All right, now I'm here with my organization account. You can see that I'm on the metric, and I can see my metric library here. I want to insert a cavity, insert the construction port. And now I can see that much smaller list of construction ports here. So add my modified one just to show that I can. So again, crazy modification that I made here. Here's the regular. This is the regular. It's my modification. These modifications are just to illustrate you can customize in just about any way you so desire. I'm going to start a new block. And all of our regular functionalities are still available within NetBlok. So if I change it to inch and I upload an inch XML from a circuit, there it is. And I see I can still insert those things from the XML. So my inch library, I have added exactly what I need to make this particular XML. So if I was a salesman, I didn't want them doing anything crazy with construction ports, I'd say, you get these 4 construction ports. And when I use the construction port command, I can only see my short ports that I assigned back in our project space. So I don't see any questions in the chat, but that is our webinar for today. If you do have any additional questions, please do not hesitate to contact us via email. We would love to answer them. And in conclusion, the whole purpose of this enhancement is to be able to share data across your company so that when a design engineer who's used MDTools looks at something, they can look at the same thing that everyone else is looking at, and there should be no confusion back and forth on, well, I don't know what our NetBlok users were. I don't know where they pulled those cavities. Now they can pull them from exactly the same source. Right. And send you back to Frank. There's no questions.
All right. That will be all the time we've got today then. If you guys have any questions, you can follow up with us via email and we will respond within 24 hours. You can send it to support@vestusa.com. I'd like to thank Megan for delivering today's product application demonstration. We'd be grateful if you could complete a short survey at the conclusion of today's webinar. Also, tomorrow you'll receive an email link containing a link to view a replay of today's session. Feel free to share this link with your colleagues. A link to view video segments from prior webinars will also be included in that email. Can you pull up the
yep.
PowerPoint?
Of course. There we go.
As you can see, we do have the webinar series posted on our various social media channels. We invite you to follow these channels so you can receive the latest updates on our upcoming webinars, as well as any product releases we have coming out. Our next webinar is scheduled to occur Thursday, June 6th, where we will demonstrate how to design a motor-mounted manifold using MDTools. Thanks again, Megan, and thanks to everyone for attending today's session. Have a pleasant and safe day.